I think hopefully this will clarify some things for you guys, give you a better perspective on what all this stuff really means. I know there's a lot of buzzwords floating around, and whether you're really advanced with this stuff already or just getting into kind of studying the science behind player development, I think this will be valuable for you. So jumping right into it, science, as I just somewhat alluded to, should not be a scary, incomprehensible or impractical part of player development. But unfortunately, we're kind of at the stage right now where it is. It is a little bit tough to understand. It's still very, again, buzzword heavy, and a lot of people don't really understand the actual concepts behind this. And a lot of the concepts are very simple, and we're not doing it justice by, talking about them in a very, very complex way. Now, traditionally, what do people define what works on in player development, right? It's single case studies. So, hey, this player or this method worked for this player, so, it's got to work for everyone. Or, hey, this method worked for this coach, so it's got to work for everyone. Or in this environment, so it's got to work for everyone. Survivorship bias is pretty similar to this, right? We look at the best players in the world and see what they not only did, but what they do now, and assume that that is how, or that is what works. That's the gold standard of player development, when in reality, many times they're there not because of that method, but despite of that method. Or they get to that point and then they implement certain methods that may not actually have anything to do with their development and anything to do with them becoming the best in the world. So survivorship bias is very important to understand here. And really just like understanding that just because you grew up with a trainer, or just because you were mentored by a certain coach, or you were in a certain environment that exposed you to certain methods, doesn't mean that this is the law. And I think that's a very liberating feeling when you understand that you don't have to just do, what your mentors have taught you and poured into you to do. Obviously take and pull from what they have provided you, but continue to learn. And that leads me into or a mindset shift I want you guys to make today, which is just completely clearing your canvas, right? Again, even if you are very aligned with some of these science-based concepts already, or like evidence-inspired concepts already, still clear your canvas. Don't come into this with predisposed notions. Imagine that you have no philosophy on player development right now, and you're a blank slate. And that's exactly how I want you guys to approach this entire coaches clinic. So the nature of science, especially or more specifically geared towards player development, is number one, it is very valuable because it gives us insight onto how humans do things, specifically learn and develop in this case. And it's pretty good proof of this. However, I want to say this before anything, kind of preface this entire coaches clinic with the fact that this should be taken with a grain of salt, right? Number one, a lot of the studies that we look at do have small sample sizes, and they're not super representative of the populations that maybe we work with. Sometimes some of these studies, especially like a little bit more of the older ones, will have, random college students that just volunteered for a study, and we see results or certain proof with them when we look into these methods that may not be applicable to elite athletes, to young athletes, to high school athletes. So that's very important to understand, is that it's not always super representative. Now, they have been doing some really good research probably over the past like half decade now that are more representative populations, which is really fun to learn from because they're more elite athletes, more like, solid level high school type case studies, which are extremely valuable to look at. But still, take it with a grain of salt. All of these are more controlled versions of a dynamic, chaotic game. There's so much that goes into the game of basketball, so many variables that it's hard to control this in, I don't want to say a lab, but in a setting that allows us to take robust, clear conclusions from it. And then if we do look at it in a dynamic, chaotic game, then it's impossible for us to know exactly what the source of these improvements are, the source of this effect that we may determine to have happened. And then a lot of these are shorter interventions as well, right? As player development coaches, we're usually looking on at least a 2-3 year scale, if not longer, in terms of how we want to develop athletes. Most of what we see in the research is going to be shorter interventions, so a couple months, a couple weeks of training. And also very important to understand that, with time, a lot of things can change. So what science is not, and it's funny to you guys probably right now that I'm almost shitting on the science a little bit, but I want to be on the same page here that, again, it is certain things and it's not certain things. And what it isn't is it's not a plug and play formula. You can't say, oh, this scientific study says this, so this is, everything that I need to know about, number one, using this method, but number two, player development in general. It's definitely not a final answer because of those things that I mentioned and because there are so many different variables and confounding variables that come into play. It's not useful without coaching skill, right? There's a lot of researchers out there who really know their stuff, but coaching is an art. Communication is an art. Knowing how to adjust the training to meet each athlete and scale back or forward some of these methods is very, very valuable. And it's not perfectly transferable as well. Okay. Which hopefully you guys understand. Now, what it is, and hopefully this will give you guys an appreciation that will lead us into all these concepts. Number one, it's a lens through which we can see the game more clearly, right? It's a framework that we can build on. It's a tool for us to ask questions and to be curious about these things and to spark some ideas. And it's a way to improve your coaching decisions, but it's not a guiding principle and the only guiding principle that we should be following, right? And if we're on the same page about that, what it is, what it isn't, the strengths that it has, the drawbacks that it has as well, I think everyone will be best equipped to use the science in the best way possible. So the goal of this clinic is going to be to simplify the big, more extensively studied concepts. I could go in for hours and hours and hours, which I kind of did on the book that I dropped today, with different concepts and super niche concepts that I would find interesting, but obviously we only have limited time. So I want to study primarily the bigger ones and clear up some of those ideas for you guys. Number two, all of this is going to be seen through the lens of applying the art and the science together. So you're going to see some really practical examples of some of these things. It's not just, hey, here's the science, here's a bunch of research, here are all the studies, and go and, try to do your best with it. No, it's going to be practical, and I want to spark ideas as much as possible. Lastly, before we get into it, my background on this, if you guys are not super familiar or haven't been following for a while now, really for the last 8 years, I've been focusing daily on understanding the science behind player development, talking to researchers, studying the research, reading books, diving into everything, especially with ChatGPT now. It's been an extremely fun rabbit hole to go down. But at the same time, I've been practically applying this with really thousands of athletes on pretty much a daily basis to find what works practically. So I don't want you guys to sit here and be like, yo, this guy's a freaking nerd. All he does is look at the science. But I also don't want you guys to think that, there hasn't been the research done behind it, because sometimes I can go against what the normal, less so the practitioner, but more so the researchers will say, just because I've seen that certain things in practice are not as functional as they may be in the research. So again, my goal is to have science and art take a nice little handshake and work together. All right. Now let's jump into it with the one that is the biggest buzzword right now, and the one that I think many people do not understand at a high level. And if coaches and even strength and conditioning coaches and front offices and parents and everyone understood, we would be in a much better place as a basketball culture, especially really worldwide, but especially in America. But that's a different topic. So really, what is the CLA, right? That's a question that not many people ask. We often see it, and there are these misconceptions that come up, right? It's like, oh, the CLA is just using small-sided games. No, like the CLA, the constraints-led approach, for you guys who are not familiar, as I'll get into the definition, the constraints-led approach is just as effective on air as it is in the concept of, or in the context of, small-sided games. A lot of people also consider the constraints-led approach to be against, rep it out or reps. I would argue that CLA actually improves the quality of repetition. It's also not anti-technique, right? Again, there's a big misconception if you guys are familiar, and if you guys are like lost in this, trust me, I'll explain all this. The constraints-led approach is definitely not anti-technique, right? Again, people think like, all right, well, you guys just say technique doesn't matter because you don't coach it up specifically. I wouldn't say it doesn't matter. I would say it actually is a better tool, or maybe not better, but a tool, a very powerful tool to actually build better technique. It's not chaos. It's not just random drills. It's not just adding constraints for fun or saying, yo, go out and play a bunch of basketball and you're going to get good. It's not. Okay. And you guys will see what the constraints-led approach actually means, right? This is the definition. It's very, very simple. It's the approach that players learn best by solving problems rather than being told what to do. And what the constraints-led approach does is design these environments or tasks that propose these problems to athletes that they must solve and guiding them towards better solutions, right? So again, it's less of what you see on the court. It's less of just, hey, we're going to play a bunch of small-sided games. It's less of, differential learning, which we'll talk about, but more of an approach that we can bring into any method, whether it's on air, whether it's live, whether it's watching film, whether it's psychological work. All of this can be applied through the lens of the constraints-led approach. So to understand this better, we've got to understand the three types of constraints: environmental, individual, and task constraints. Environmental constraints are features of the environment that shape how athletes behave, right? So if you think about going outside to play in a pickup game, you're probably going to play differently based on the surface. Maybe you have a constrained space, so you're not going to drive as much. You're going to play a little bit more upright. If it's hot as hell outside, then, maybe you'll try to conserve your energy. So as a result of the environment shaping this game itself or this task, you are going to utilize different movement solutions, behave differently. In other words, play a different style. And this can go for really anything that you see, whether it's playing in a perfect gym. You're going to have obviously some behavioral implications from that. Whether it's playing in a darker gym, whether it's playing on a double rim, whether it's growing up in an environment with a specific culture that changes the way you see things, and as a result, changes your approach to basketball or changes an athlete's approach to basketball. So really anything both physically in the environment and culturally in the environment, socially in the environment, really can shape how athletes develop. And we need to understand this, as we'll discuss, to best figure out a plan of attack for developing them, which leads me to individual constraints, which is many times just the results of the environment that an athlete grows up in. Obviously, you have the more physical constraints, the more unique qualities like wingspan, just general anthropometrics, how they move, the sports they played growing up, and as a result, certain like affordances they may see, or certain physical qualities that they may have developed, or certain compensations that they may now have. They may come to you with certain mental models or beliefs or limiting factors psychologically that come from the environment that they grew up in, whether it's their family or their culture or, athletes that they were playing against. So every athlete's going to come to you with individual constraints that are going to shape the way that they see things, the way that they learn, the way that they develop. Task constraints are the ones that we talk about most in terms of the CLA and being practical, right? These are rules that we can place on a task to generate very specific behavior from an athlete. Again, these are most commonly used, and I'll dive into how to use these a little bit. So I like to look at these on a spectrum from evaluation to manipulation. Evaluation meaning this is more so what we look at to understand the athlete and evaluate them. Manipulation meaning this is what we can actually use in practice during our training sessions, our games, our drills, to shape the behavior and help athletes problem solve a little bit. Individual, very hard to manipulate here. You can't say, all right, I'm going to have you play this one-on-one drill with, longer arms here. It just most times does not happen. So this is more so, okay, what's your profile of individual constraints that we need to understand as coaches to best serve you? Environmental, a lot of this is learning where they've come from, the environment that they've grown up in or played in or have played in most consistently. But we can also creatively adjust this, especially on a macro scale, right? So like, this can be as simple as with your younger athletes lowering the hoop. This could be, that's always a debate whether that's a task constraint or environmental, but I usually like to consider anything in the playing environment environmental. This can be something like dimming the lights, which we've done a decent amount for good shooters in our gym here, where if we just want to challenge them at times, we're going to dim the lights to really challenge like their gaze, and their quiet eye on the rim. This can be taking athletes outside and playing in a super hot environment, or going to have them play a pickup game at an outdoor court instead of being in a beautiful gym all summer, right? So we can manipulate these a little bit, but this is also very potent for evaluation. task constraints are the ones that we most often manipulate. And these are the reason why there's a little lever thing here is because I always like to allude, to almost like a cockpit. Like if you've ever seen, presumably, pilots in like a cockpit and there's all these little buttons and levers that you can pull. That's how I see us as architects of games, of drills using the constraints load approach, where we're not just telling an athlete what to do. We're not sitting there telling the plane, hey, do this, do this. We're pulling all these different levers, pressing all these different buttons to get exactly what we want out of it. So individual constraints can go down to all these physical qualities, whether it's, shoulder mobility that decides how you shoot and your release point, the dominant eye that you shoot with, how springy your feet and your ankle complex is, to be able to create power from the ground, confidence, pain, discomfort, like all these go into just how a player may shoot a free throw. And we need to consider this when we are setting our task constraints up and building athletes. Environmentally, this is a good one to look at. The Kyrie, like old backboard story where he grew up playing, and this is a passage from the book, that I released today as well. He grew up playing on a backboard that was missing like different sections. I think it was, the middle section of the backboard. So as a result, he had to develop the soft touch to put the ball anywhere on the backboard, find obviously the English, the spin. I don't know if this is true, but I believe said it, or at least a couple guys, Amon Shumpert or somebody said it on a podcast. But this is a beautiful example of how a constraint can unknowingly develop an athlete's skill level and adaptability without even being adjusted purposefully by a coach or by anybody.
Here's a super easy example.
And then quickly, I'll have you guys watch this video. Real quickly, I will need you guys to test if the audio works. So if it's not working, somebody just feel free to jump in and let me know.
Here's a super easy example of how changing one rule or constraint in your drill can change everything. So the initial constraint here was to jump from outside of the paint, which ended up in a lot of floaters.
Jump from outside, land inside.
Now, with this simple adjustment, you're going to see a lot more aggression. They can't rely on taking a floater. They have to attack from outside to inside, which is now going to push them to cover ground on those layups, to get some contact mid-air, to test their abilities a little bit. And in drill design, a lot of the time, it's just a simple change.
So a very simple example there of a task constraint going from, hey, you have to jump outside the paint to, hey, you have to jump outside to inside the paint. And that completely shapes the behavior that they go with from floaters, more runner type shots into aggressive layups. And that's a perfect example of one of those levers that you can pull or buttons that you can press to create a completely different outcome than if you hadn't pressed anything at all, or if you just go in there saying, try to finish more aggressively, because then it's less of a problem and more of a command that the athlete is getting. Now, why do we do this? Why don't we just tell athletes what to do and hope that they improve? Great question. This is something that I've tried to answer for years as clearly as possible, so hopefully I'll do it well here. Number one, self-organization. This allows players to find their own solutions, not just your preferred technique or the one that you have in mind, right? When you think about how the best athletes have learned, the best basketball players have grown up, they're constantly hunting for their own solutions, right? Many times they don't just have a coach that tells them do this, do this, do this. They go out, they experiment, they try new things out, they see what works, what doesn't work, they innovate, they come up with certain things that maybe nobody ever really would have taught them, but they've just figured out because even if it's just unstructured pickup games or 1v1 growing up, they did a lot of this and they did it with the mindset of experimenting and trying things out. And this is what we can breed in our training. Again, whether this is on air or in a live small-sided game, the CLA better allows for athletes to fit their individual constraint profile, and as a result, have games that are more tailored for them, not just for what we think as coaches. And trust me on this, no matter how good you are as a coach, you never know what will actually work best for an athlete. And many times you can limit athletes by giving them one solution or two solutions, or, essentially describing something for them and hoping that they follow it. Because in reality, in a small-sided game or in a drill that allows for them to explore via constraints, they may find 8 different solutions that work for them, a few of which you may have never even thought of or not in the context of that athlete. So self-organization is huge. With this, they also learn how to learn. So instead of just, hey, coach tells me this, I recite. Coach tells me this, I recite. They are problem solving every time. And as a result, with every problem that they solve, they become a better problem solver. So in a game, not only can they learn more autonomously when they're on their own, but they're also used to solving problems, which comes down to adaptability. The third one, no matter what chaos is going on, no matter what environment they're in, they're able to adapt to what the environment provides to them, what the defense provides to them, what the situation or circumstances provides to them, versus when they train in a more controlled, like top-down environment, again, where a coach is just telling them what to do and they recite or repeat or execute, they become so much more adaptable. And this is where we see athletes at every level doing things that we would never expect them to do, or we have never seen them do. And that's just because they've been exposed to so many problems that once they see a new problem, it's not like, oh, I've never solved this problem before. It's, oh, I'm a problem solver. I'm adaptable enough to figure this out. And that's where new techniques emerge. And also just aligns perfectly with how humans naturally learn movement, which we'll talk about when we come to the motor learning section. A couple examples here of how this looks in practice.
We're going to start off chest to shoulder, okay? So we're here, it's like maybe I come off a ball screen, he recovers, whatever. Whenever I go, I can separate wherever I want to in this general area. I'm trying to get a shot off with him full contested, okay? So I'm here, I'm using my body, I'm using kind of unpredictability to be able to pop up and knock that down. Nice, you go. Yo, real quick, try to get as far as you can on this one. As far as you can, create space. Now, watch me. Diego, you play defense. I literally didn't cover much ground. Point being, sometimes, like everyone talks about create space. It's not about creating as much space as possible, but just enough that you need. Like that little window of space. So rather than always trying to get all the way out there, sometimes just get that little pound dribble, like just this much space, and pop up, and watch how it's a lot more open sometimes in the long run. Yeah, there we go. Better. Just as much as you need. Nice, Diego.
All right, so that's a pretty good example of a couple things. Number one, as you saw in the text, that moved by pretty quick. Usually I would question them a little bit more. I didn't do the best job of that in that sense. Part of the constraints-led approach in practice is, again, leading them to the solution versus giving them the solution. So we only have 30 minutes in these little summer academy sessions that we do. So sometimes it takes a little bit more supplementation on like speaking and explaining versus questioning. But I would strongly suggest from a communication standpoint, questioning, right? And trying to lead them to the answer so that they're learning a little bit more autonomously through guided discovery. Secondly, though, I would say this is a great way to see how one can teach through the game in these small-sided games, still through the CLA, right? The constraints were simple. The start was obviously like a half advantage start, shoulder to the chest, and then they had one dribble they couldn't pump fake. Very simple task constraints there that allowed them to explore different movement solutions. And then you can go in through, from a coaching standpoint and go, hey, try this, experiment with this. Why are you doing this? Why should you do this? And just work through them, provide, problems with them. And if anyone's ever had like a really good teacher before, math teacher, whatever, who didn't just sit at the front and lecture you and hope that you learn, they'll sit down with you. They're not going to tell you the answer, but they're going to go, yo, have you thought about this? Okay, maybe try this. And then eventually you have that epiphany moment where you're like, okay, that makes sense. That's more so the goal of what we're trying to get to. Second example here are creativity.
Here's one of the best ways to challenge your brain to build up your bag and add new tools to the toolbox based on the science of skill acquisition. And it's simple. You put yourself in a specific situation and force yourself to get 10 buckets with 10 different moves or solutions. So here, for example, he's got to get some sort of dribble pickup into a 2-foot finish or floater, which is a big focus of ours. And right here, you're seeing reps 5 to 10, and this is where it gets tough. This is where you really have to search out for new solutions. But with a little brainstorming, creativity, and instinct, you end up trying stuff you've never tried before. Same thing here with the quick attack and transition.
Yo, off the right.
Once you knock out the simple ones like he had before this, it becomes a real mental challenge. And by searching for these new solutions and eventually breaking through a barrier, you're building what we would call fluency, or your ability to come up with new ideas on the spot. And while most people will tell you that all you need to do is master 1 to 2 moves, the deeper the toolbox, the more situations you're prepared for, and as a result, the more confident and coordinated you are. So with drills like this, we're looking to add or at least experiment with as much as we can.
So those are what I call creativity constraints. In other words, any sort of, hey, you cannot do this twice, or hey, you have to find X amount of ways to do this, which is a great way to encourage some exploration. And then you saw us, and I mentioned it in the video, going through and saying, hey, have you thought about this? Experiment with this. Yo, watch me real quick. I'm going to show you something. So you can kind of inject these ideas into the process, while not completely giving them the answer. And you can see the difficulty, but also the engagement that creates for a guy who, averaged 30 plus in the G League.
Everything in a drill like this is purposeful. First off, obviously,
this one, I'll go back.
Everything in a drill like this.
Actually, before I go back, this one will be more so showing you how to adjust different task constraints and pull those levers, press those buttons to get exactly what you want.
Everything in a drill like this is purposeful. First off, obviously we have a spatial constraint here, making sure the space is representative of a real game. Then this initial defender who's starting by jumping from hip to hip has a ball in their hand to limit their movement, so this offensive player usually gets by, but allows them to give a stronger push, which is a big focus of the drill, staying on your line to the rim. Then this defender stepping over late, so whenever the offense goes, which usually gives the offense a momentum advantage, encouraging more athletic, crafty finish. And lastly, this defender has to hold the stick right under the pad, shortening their wingspan and making it more possible to finish with contact and not get their shit sent. So this is all a recipe for the perfect level of difficulty and to target specific skills. And all these little factors should be the things you think about when you're designing a drill.
So those little factors could be how the defender holds that blocking pad, right? It could be how wide or at which angle we place the poles. It could be how you start. It could be obviously the defensive constraints. So instead of holding the ball, it could be starting somewhere else, or hands behind the back. There are so many different things that we can adjust here. And I promise you guys, once you start to see it through this lens, every single button that you press is going to create a completely different problem and therefore different solutions. And this is where training really gets fun, because every drill is something that you can really precisely manipulate to get exactly what you want, or maybe not get exactly what you want, but create the problem that you want them to solve every time. And again, that's where they can surprise you at times. So moving on from constraints-led approach, hopefully that gives you guys a little bit more clarity there, and feel free to, actually, you know what? If you guys have any questions, let's take like 2 or 3 minutes here to quickly answer some. So feel free to, raise your hand, jump in, whatever, before we go on to motor learning science. Or you can wait until the end. It's up to you guys.
Hey, Cole.
Yes, sir.
Hey, would you consider putting a weight vest on somebody like that, an individual constraint?
Yeah, for sure. I would say that's an individual constraint. Now I'm going to challenge you or anybody to think about the problem and the potential solutions that may come from putting a weight vest on somebody.
Well, I mean, obviously you probably raise a little bit of an injury risk if you're jumping and stuff like that. So within controlled reason, but I would say you might slow somebody down.
Yeah.
Especially if they're training with people that are slower than them, you might slow them down or something like that.
Yeah, that could be a good one for sure. So, I mean, my mind always races on stuff like this. I'm thinking if I were to put a weight vest on somebody, again, they would have to be, it's a very strong athlete who is, we've worked up to this capacity, let's assume. Maybe you start to get a little bit more slow steps around the rim, or maybe you don't actually because they don't want to decelerate with added force. So maybe you start to get some different, on the ground 1 foot finishes. They're using a little bit more unpredictability because their system doesn't really want to expend that much energy to jump with a weight vest on. Or maybe you have some athletes, and this is why it's important to understand individual constraints, who are super aggressive. They accept challenge like this. They, maybe they grew up training with a weight vest because their dad had them doing boxing workouts and stuff. And they're I'm going all in on this. And now they're jumping. They're using that weight vest to add, essentially force to or momentum, to their playing style. And they're going around just bumping everybody. So again, that shows you how many different ways each little task constraint can go. But yeah, I would say that's definitely a task constraint. It's always fun to look into how those can affect the process. Yeah, whoever's got a hand up.
Hey, how are you making task manipulations? I know, I guess some of them are done on the fly. Are some just something you've prepared after examining the kids?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely a little bit of both. And it's something I talk about pretty extensively in the new book as well. Like how to adjust these things, but more so how to know when and how to adjust them. Um, with higher level players, I would say I usually come in with a little bit more of a plan. Um, just because it's easier to understand the very, very specific things that they are good at and not good at. So their superpowers and their rate limiters. Um, so it'll still be a lot on the fly where I'll see certain things like, oh shoot, I need to change this drill a little bit, or okay, they figured this out, or hey, this is maybe a new technique or a new solution that I want them to see that I'm not really seeing right now. So let me adjust this on the fly. With younger athletes, like if I'm running a workout or even a team practice with, like middle school players, high school players, younger players in general, it'll be more so on the fly because the goal for me is to expose them to a wider variety of problems and solutions. So it's less about like really targeting certain things, which obviously there'll be some of that, but more about how much I can expose them to. And sometimes they respond to certain things very well. Sometimes they don't. It's less predictable. So that's going to be something where it's usually pretty on the fly and just kind of figuring out, getting creative with like all the different, task constraints that we can adjust to, provide them with different problems to solve, I would say. And that's really part of the art for sure. That's a great question, by the way. I think somebody else has a hand up. I heard it come in.
Yeah, I have a question. What do you
Yeah.
think about the intensity when you design a CLA drill, about the intensity you want to put the player on? So low intensity, mid intensity, high intensity, and whatever the profile. So it could be a young athlete, a middle school, even a pro. Um, how you handle the intensity to target what you want them to work and to
Mhm.
transfer properly in the game and to get the improvement you're looking for.
Yes, great question. So when we really look at it, like obviously what's going to transfer best to the game and what athletes are going to retain the best is something that is as representative as possible, meaning that it's something that mimics the game as much as possible. So when we talk about intensity, of course, when we talk about game transfer, more intense drills are likely going to directly transfer to a game better. Now, with that being said, there is time to decrease the intensity. One, when a skill is not really yet learned and athletes can't really grasp it. So sometimes we need to decrease the intensity or the complexity of the drill to ensure that they can at least start to get the hang of it. And that could be, making it an on-air thing where they just go on and pick up some coordination, or that could be maybe removing a defender or moving them closer to the basket, in the midst of like a small-sided game. Um, Now other times, so one is being able to, I guess, grasp new concepts. Two, sometimes when it's in season, maybe it's been a long week, you can't go fully intense drills. It's just not possible for most athletes, especially older athletes, in terms of how much we're loading the nervous system and even their physiology. So there will be at times and plenty of times, and this is something I'm dealing with now in season, and I talk to coaches, all around the world about, is how we can still have athletes make decisions and still shape their behavior through small sided games, but do it in a maybe not a very low intensity, but a much lower intensity manner that, prevents injury or allows them to stay fresh, allows us to get more reps. So I typically lean that way, especially, in season with higher level players. Now with lower level players or younger players really, especially if they're 14 years old or below, this may be an unpopular opinion, but I don't really believe in load management for 12, 13-year-olds. I think, there's this trend now where, young athletes are seeing, and especially their parents and their coaches are saying like, hey, NBA players are, doing load management and, injuries are going up. So we need our 12-year-old they can't do too many small sided games. But then the same parents are the ones who say, oh, I was out all day when I was a kid training 12 hours or playing 12 hours a day out on the blacktop, right? And without going into the science here, younger athletes are literally supercharged to recover quickly, and they don't need much recovery for a laundry list of reasons. So with younger athletes, long story short, we'll go pretty intense on these small-sided games and do a lot of them. And obviously there's going to be a time where, you start to teach them to listen to their bodies as they get older, as they get into like high school age, 15. But with younger athletes, like we'll go pretty intense and they love it, right? If anyone's ever worked with younger athletes, assuming most of you guys have, you know how much they want to play and compete and be engaged, and they can do it for hours on end. And I think more often than not, coaches take away from that than play into it. So long story short, you have the entire spectrum, right? Younger athletes, let them play, let them be intense. Obviously there's times to distill those and decrease the intensity. Older athletes, we still want it to be intense. We really do. But of course we have to manage their load a little bit, both like in terms of their nervous system and in terms of their body, their structures. But there's going to be a time and a place for both, and learning how to still make lower intensity games and drills high quality is a very important, step to take as a coach, I would say. Great question as well.
Okay,
Anything
thank you.
else? Maybe get one more, before we move on, or wait till the end.
Hey, Cole. Just wanted to say first off, congrats on getting the book out. I think it's
Thank you,
awesome
man.
just getting everything put down and, something you can pick up and go back to whenever you need to. So I'll definitely be grabbing it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, my question is more related to, the evaluation, area. So I work with large groups of young players and I don't get too much contact time with them. And obviously usually I'm going in with a plan and I kind of have in my mind what I'm looking at. Usually we're talking mostly technical stuff,
Right.
but I'm trying to think of like some base drills, some base ideas that's going to help me almost kind of supercharge my ability to evaluate in these short spaces of time. So the question is, do you have any kind of go-to or more evaluation related drills that you go into?
Yes, absolutely. So I actually have a list of 10. So this is in the book. There are 10 like go-to games that if you only had to do 10 games, those would be mine.
Got it.
And it's also on our By Any Means Coaches podcast, I also just talked about that. So a lot of those are pretty simple, without going too much in it, because obviously you can feel free to check out the podcast for a deeper explanation. Cause that is something that I'm glad you asked and is a fantastic question. What I've always noticed is the simpler the game and the more familiar you are with it as a coach and the more you've used it, the better you can evaluate, because you spend less time managing the drill and more time watching the athlete, right? So it's more so about like, and your like toolbox or, go-to 10 small-sided games may be different than mine than somebody else's, but developing that toolbox where you can say, all right, if I need to be super simple with this, I'm just going to use these 10 games or, some mix of them. And then within those games, you can adjust those constraints, right? So if you want to evaluate and see a player, how they finish at the rim, we can use like a quick ball on back, like advantage finishing drill. And then I just throw a bunch of different constraints at him. All right, you got to finish off 2 feet. All right, now you have to go up and create contact first. Okay, now you have to use your weak hand. So now we're evaluating all these skills in the context of the same game, just by adjusting the task constraints, so that we can see how athletes solve different problems. And that's really how I see evaluation, right? Is less so, can you do this, but more so, how do you solve this problem? And having those go-tos to present those problems to athletes is really the key.
For sure. Thanks, man.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on. Keep thinking of questions though, because honestly, I could go on with these all day. Moving on from the constraints-led approach into motor learning science. These are ingrained for sure, but this is more so just understanding how humans in general move and learn to do so. Why is this important? Well, I think we forget oftentimes that basketball is about movement, like all about movement. Everything we do requires us to move well and move for the right reason. So understanding how humans learn to move is everything for us as coaches. And when you really consider and see how decision making truly goes hand in hand with movement, hopefully you'll see the importance of this even more. So a couple big concepts here. Number one is the perception action cycle. Many of you guys may have heard of this, but hopefully I can explain this in a very simple manner. The core concept behind this is that movement is not isolated. We don't move just to move, right? It's executed in the context of our environment, of all the constraints that we have going on in the game, in a practice, whatever we're doing, right? So we have perception. Let's just imagine a player is dribbling up the floor and they got a defender pressuring them. Cool. Perception is understanding where your initial defender is, where the help defense is, where your teammates are, understanding time and score, perceiving internally how you feel. Are you fatigued? Are you feeling like, you're on a little bit of a heater and you're feeling good in rhythm? This is the perception, and this all has to happen in under a second, a half second, which we'll talk about. The decision is obviously choosing to do so, which is something that not only takes time, but takes up mental energy. And then the action is actually executing the action. But this is what we focus on, or traditional training, player development focuses on 99% of the time, outside of the context of these two, perception and decision, right? Then the reason why the arrow goes back here is because the action that you make then puts you in a new situation that you have to perceive. So again, if you're coming down the court, you're getting pressured, you perceive a defender reaching in and you know that you have space somewhere. Okay, then maybe you get into a little spin, or maybe another athlete with different individual constraint profiles get into a different move, right? Because you've decided to do that. Then after you do that, you have to make another perception, decision, and action to decide whether you drive, whether you pass, whether you shoot. And this is just constantly flowing during a game. Perception, or perceive, decide, act. Perceive, decide, act. And everyone informs the next, right? Now, this sounds very complex, and that's because it is. I think we oversimplify movement many times, and you can see this in planned and unplanned movements. Mind you, this is a post I made like years ago, but you can see without the flags in the gym. But I always come back to this one because this is even just with an audio cue, right? So there was one where I was making two dribbles, going with a little crossover. And then there was another one where I was making as many dribbles as I needed to until somebody said go. And that's when I reacted and made this move, right? So this is even without much perception. I'm not reacting to like representative, or like specifying information from the game, more so just an audio cue. And you can still see here how the technique changes. This looks super clean, right? It's a nice little clean line of force. This other foot is supporting me. This foot's off the ground. I get into a deeper joint angle. I get more trunk lean here. It's less clean. It's more imperfect. And if reactive movement and a very simple reaction is uglier, maybe not uglier depending on how you look at it, but is less technically sound than a planned movement or essentially a recited movement, then we're going to have to train for this. And this means in a game when we have to react to actual humans and deal with them, giving us some contact and forcing us to adjust our angle and whatever the case may be, we need to consider that everything is not just an action. It comes from perception. It comes from decision. And then that truly changes how we execute this action, right? So I'm not saying, and the next slide will show you this, I'm not saying that all movement should be trained or built in the context of defenders or a reaction, but more of it should be. When you look at this and you consider how complex this cycle actually is and what movement really is in the grand scheme of things, you start to think, even just logically without looking at, the science behind this, and which has shown how much more effective it is to train movement ingrained in the environment. You just start to think like, damn, am I really preparing athletes for what they're doing in a game, for the types of skills and the problems that they're solving in the game? Most times you sit there and go, maybe not. Now, with that being said, building the ceiling, I like to call it, or action capacity is still very important, right? And this is, I don't want to say the bulk, but a lot of what we will do with our on-air drills, where, hey, we don't always need the perception and decision. Sometimes it's just about building the capacity at which we can execute this action. Sometimes players will have the perception to see it like an affordance or an opportunity, right? If they come off a ball screen and they see a defender step out, sometimes they understand, oh, I want to split this screen, right? I've seen the opportunity to do that. They may even decide to do that, but they don't have the control, or they don't have like the quick pop off the ground in terms of their change of direction ability to actually execute this. So this is where something building action capacity, or the ability to execute this action at a higher skill level, is important, right? So this could be just general control of the ball, really challenging how different ways that you can control the ball, fluidity and control of the jumper. Obviously, I would say shooting is one of the best qualities in an on-air environment or a 1v0 environment to build, because yes, it is extremely important to train with decisions, but everyone here knows that you can become a really good shooter, or at least take steps towards becoming a really good shooter without the entire context of the game. This could be more physiological qualities that, maybe we look at from like a strength and conditioning standpoint. So ankle stiffness, body control on finishes. So this is really just expanding the edges of what you can do or what your athletes can do, right? And this is where sometimes it may look not very game-like, and that's actually a good thing, because if we do game-like things all the time in a 1v0 environment with no defense, nothing is going to be game-like, because there's no defense. It's not a game. So how is something going to be game-like? Instead, I like to shift our mindset towards, okay, if we don't have all of the, or at least some of the constraints or the variables that represent a game, we need to turn our attention towards building action capacity, which oftentimes is going to take us getting outside the box and almost looking at this from, I don't want to say a strength and conditioning standpoint, but everyone understands, okay, when you squat in the weight room, or you do plyos on the turf, you are not doing this because you're doing it in a game. You're doing it to build qualities. You're doing it to build pieces of the bigger puzzle. And this is what action capacity really is. But so many players tend to stop their training here, as I discussed in this, right? So as much as building action capacity can be valuable, continue to consider how much perception decision really matters, and how much training can be more valuable at times if it is ingrained in.
All right. So notice here how.
Now, quickly, I want to go into functional movement variability, which I'll just use this video to best represent.
All right. So notice here how all of these are floaters, right? And by the same player, Emmanuel Quickly, and every single one is a little bit, if not a decent amount, different. Okay. Obviously, not only the foot that he's jumping off, whether it's 1 foot, 2 foot, but also the angle he's taking, his release angle, whether he's rotating or not, the speed that he's at. All of these things are constantly changing. So as we think about floater technique and how to shoot floaters, yes, we want to have kind of a stabilized floater form, but even more quickly than a jump shot or other skills, we want to get comfortable with as many types, as many variances in technique as we possibly can.
So floaters and certain skills like this that have a little bit more room for error are very easy to see what we call functional movement variability, which is just the ability to adjust your technique to fit the situation while still getting the same outcome. In this case, making the shot, right? So if you look at the best players, again, they're not executing every crossover the same way. They're not executing every pass the same way. They're not even executing every jump shot the same way, because in a game, you're going to need to adjust your form or your technique or the way in which, the style in which you execute these skills to match the situation or the constraints around you, right? Now, this is important to realize that this is a better determinant of expertise than consistency, right? So when we look at athletes and how they move, higher level athletes and how they move, it's not about who can repeat the same thing over and over and over again in the exact same way. It's about who can adjust that technique to best deal with the environment around them and the task that they have to execute, the problem they have to solve, right? Now, with this being said, couple caveats as always. Number one, with younger athletes, we do want to stabilize technique a little bit, as I alluded to in that floater video even, where it's like, hey, let's build a very decent foundation of technique, right? We don't want you shooting floaters above your head or doing some crazy stuff where, like, it's just not fluid at all. It's super rigid. So that's maybe an area where we do aim for some consistency at first, especially with something like a jump shot. We don't want to provide these athletes with just an immense amount of variability and inconsistency at first. We would like to have a nice little model of technique to go off of, but way too many players stick at that for way too long before they start to add in some functional movement variability or look to add some functional movement variability. Also consider here that we have things called attractors and fluctuators. Attractors are things or are components of this technique, call it a jumper, that should stay the same. These are the essential variables, right? So where you release the ball, like your release window, should not be all over the place. That's something that we would like to keep consistent in the context of a jump shot. Hand placement, we would like to keep consistent. The steady gaze on the rim or the quiet eye, we would like to keep consistent even through chaos. Even energy transfer and rhythm, all of these are more so determinants of success in chaotic environments when we adjust our technique than things that can fluctuate the elemental variables or the fluctuators like release height and timing, torso angle, how high you jump, where you're drifting with your shot. These are the ones that experts have been shown to easily adjust and still keep the attractors stable to still get the same result, which is making the shot in the context of a jump shot, right? Now, understand here that although jumpers here are more attractor heavy than something like a layup where we don't really have too many true attractors on a layup. You can basically do it any way you want to, overhand, underhand, different, jump types and still make it work. So these are way more fluctuator heavy and the jumpers are way more or a little bit more attractor heavy. Even with them being more attractor heavy and wanting to keep some more stability here, there are still far more fluctuators than attractors. These and maybe a couple more are the core things that we want to keep consistent. Everything else, once we get to a point where these are consistent in an unchanging, easy environment, the goal of shooting is less so to continue to stabilize these in an easy shot, but more so to one, adjust these elemental variables, but two, to keep these stable through chaos, right? And where much shooting training, in my opinion, goes wrong is that, people do a decent job of trying to keep these consistent, but they do not provide enough chaos, which we'll discuss. When in reality, the goal should be training to keep these consistent while all of these kind of fluctuate around these stable factors of the jump shot, variables of the jump shot, but doing it in environments and tasks that actually challenge you. That leads me a little bit to motor noise here. Functional movement variability is often looked at through the lens of adjusting to defenders, adjusting to the game. What I didn't even realize until a couple of years ago is that it's not just about adjusting to the game. The reason why we move differently every time is not just because there's a defender there, but because it is inherent. It is because humans are not robots. We literally cannot repeat the same movement perfectly. There's always going to be an error in one, if not all of these four categories, four processes. So either when your brain, your nervous system, your spinal cord wants to execute a movement and fires a signal down to the muscles to do so. Sometimes there can be a little error in there, right? Maybe imperfect. Sometimes the fibers of your muscles do not perfectly fire. Sometimes between muscles, they don't fire at the perfect time. Even the way that you perceive everything around you may not be perfect, right? As a result, and this is seen extensively in the research, every single movement is inherently going to be a little bit different because, again, we are imperfect creatures. We are not robots who can just do the same thing over and over again, especially in a very complex movement like almost everything we do on the basketball court. So, again, what the research has shown is that skilled players actually aren't the most consistent after a certain point, right? If we look at beginners, for beginners, the more consistent ones are going to have the highest success rate, right? Because they're still stabilizing that technique. Once we get to a certain point where the technique is somewhat stabilized, experts, as I mentioned a little bit ago, are actually the best at dealing with this motor noise and adjusting their technique to do so, right? Then we have different noise amplifiers, right? So fatigue makes all of these or amplifies all of these effects, right? And you can see this when you're fatigued and you shoot a jump shot, you can feel something go wrong sometimes. Like, it just didn't feel right. Could have been, how the spinal cord sent a signal to a muscle to move. It could have been how a muscle fired because, obviously you do not have the same level, the same capacity to produce power output when you are fatigued. And so you may have some noise there. Same thing with pressure, some overthinking, like the psychological side of things. And then obviously environmental constraints, so defenders and stuff. But that's more what I would consider at least functional movement variability. So this is an extremely important concept to understand, and this is what really solidified my perspective on how one trains for basketball in general, but especially shooting, because yes, there is importance in repeatability for beginners and to stabilize attractors through chaos. But once we understand and once we embrace actually that athletes cannot move the same way twice and repeat the same movement, it empowers us to learn how to deal with that versus always just trying to converge technique into being perfect. And what that usually results in is athletes hyper fixating on their technique. They try to be too consistent. They get themselves in a little rut and they end up becoming worse shooters. Now, how do we best train movement based on how or what we know about athletes learning how to move? Number one is practice variability, right? And one of the big misconceptions that I've seen floating around in the space is people just don't really know what variability means and that there are two different types of variability. Number one is functional movement variability, which we've discussed, which is, hey, can you adjust your technique to fit the constraints around you and still be successful? We get that by now. Practice variability is how this is applied in practice, right? Simplest definition of this is just posing a new problem each time. So rather than solving the same problem every single rep for 10 reps, you adjust the problem that you solve, even if it's just a little bit of an adjustment. Simple, right? Now, why do we do this? Number one is something called contextual interference. In other words, when we jump from one problem to another, now you have different context. You have different problems to solve. So I always use the example. If you walk up to a kid and ask him, hey, what's, 8 times 8? 64. What's 8 times 8? 64. It just gets monotonous, right? There's no new problem to solve. There's no contextual interference. If you ask them a different problem every time, that delay and that thinking process is going to be requiring of a lot more attention. You're going to see that, again, a longer delay here where they're actually thinking about it. And that's the exact same thing as how we can learn skills on the basketball court, where we want to provide them with some contextual interference to make each problem a little bit more difficult to solve. Because usually once athletes figure something out, it's pretty easy for them to just monotonously continue to recite versus having to solve problems each time. And again, these don't have to be super, super drastic changes in the problem each time. This can be different footwork, different catch point on shooting, and we'll go into this a little bit. It also diversifies the problems being presented and thus the solution, the bank of solutions that one can choose from. So if you think about when you strictly do the opposite block training, you are only, especially when it's done with the mindset of consistency and trying to do the same thing every time, you are only touching on one solution out of the millions of potential solutions that athletes should be able to utilize and be comfortable with, right? So when we implement some variability, we are expanding the toolbox versus just continuing to sharpen one tool in the toolbox, which isn't inherently bad, but the drawback of that is that when it's blocked, we are not really developing this as well as we could because, again, there's no contextual interference. You're not solving the problem, just reciting the same thing. And as we've seen and hopefully understand by now, that's usually not the best way to approach building movement ability or basketball skill. Now, this sits on a spectrum, right? Repetition without repetition is a good way to approach less variability, and the more repetition without repetition we get, the less variability we have, but can still be very healthy. And what I mean by repetition without repetition is that we are repeating the same thing over and over again, but in a way with different constraints that allow athletes to find different solutions every time, right? So this could be the creativity constraints. In that one video I showed earlier where Jeff was attacking like the closeout, and I go, hey, you're going to attack the same closeout every time, maybe a little bit different in terms of how he plays it. You got to choose something different on every rep, right? Many times this already happens by itself, right? If you expose athletes to a small-sided game, no matter how simple the small-sided game is, there is going to be a different solution each time. So again, these can be very simple drills. These can be the same drill that you do for 10 minutes, but you just slightly change the constraints, tell them to move around their angles a little bit, and they're still working on the same skill or even the same concept, the same technique over and over again, but they're still getting enough variability to ensure that they learn from this. This could even be on air, right? So this could be getting up your block corner shots at the end of practice. But say every time you have to use a different footwork. So now It may not be a completely different problem. You know, they're not going from an algebra problem to a calculus problem and back, but there are slightly different problems every time, and usually you'll see the success rate go down 20, 30, 40% just from simple changes like this, where it's a very small amount of variability because they're executing the same skill over and over again, but doing it in different ways. Interleaving skills is going to be more variability. So what interleaving is jumping from one concept or one skill to another and exaggerating the variability here. So this could be something like, you know, you get a rep from the perimeter, like shooting rep, and then you switch it over and get like a closeout attack and you get to the rim. And this is something we do more so with high level athletes, where we'll still do a lot of repetition without repetition to allow them time to experiment and really get into the depths of, you know, exploring that specific problem. But we'll go, hey, you're going to get one shooting rep on this side, and then you're going to go to the other side. You're going to attack closeout, like I said, get downhill. And the third one's going to be a live ball screen rep. So they're getting 3 different situations, 3 different tasks that they have to work through in a matter of 20, 30 seconds. And this is forcing them to truly switch their attention from one to the other. And again, if we're talking about how higher level players learn, this is a really good way to do it, even in a team practice, right? So many team practices are always like, all right, we're going to start with 10 minutes of passing, and then we're going to go to ball handling, and then we're going to go to this concept, right? Defense, and then we're going to work on offense, versus starting to build more adaptable teams who are able to switch their attention from one skill, one concept to another, and then back to the next one. And this really bridges the gap to a game a lot better than strictly working on these concepts, these principles of play, these plays, whatever you're working on, in a way that's a little bit more blocked. Now, where does block fit in? And I'm getting to the end of this one here, so I'll give you guys an opportunity to ask some questions. Where does block fit into all this? Because as I've mentioned a few times, it definitely does, right? I'm not saying that everything has to be incredibly variable or variable at all. And stabilizing movement patterns, especially with younger players, is a decent way or a decent area of your player development work to include some block training. If a player comes in and their shooting technique is all over the place and they already have a ton of inherent variability because their shot changes every time visibly, then we probably would like to keep the task as simple as possible because they already struggle to solve that problem, right? They suck at the skill. Now, it's also important to realize that even higher level players can be beginners at certain skills. So there are times where if a player just can't pick up a certain footwork in the context of a small sided game or as I expose them to this with repetition without repetition, then I'll say, hey, try this out 5 times in a row. Just get it down, right? Get the feel for it, stabilize this movement pattern, and then we're going to go back to it. And that's, again, a little bit more where the practical art comes into play. Variability should also match the skill level to enter the optimal zone of improvement or the zone of optimal improvement, whatever you want to call it. Again, if we go too far into variability with less experienced athletes who are still beginners, typically we're going to be in what we call the thrash zone over here, which is a pretty low success rate where they just get frustrated and they don't really have a model to learn from because they're so far from that. So sometimes we may need to scale it down. If an athlete's shooting 10, 20% on every single drill, we're probably a little bit too much in the thrash zone. So maybe we decrease the amount of variability, lean more towards repetition without repetition, very simple version of it, and scoot them over into the optimal zone of improvement where they can best learn. But many times where I see these athletes are in the comfort zone. So it's more so about increasing contextual interference and variability and really just the challenge point in general to put them in here. And then lastly is feel good work. You know, every player knows that at some point, especially throughout the season or, you know, at the end of a long week, you want to see a lot of shots go in. Keeps the game fun. It's a good dopamine hit, right? And I think I've had a lot of conversations with athletes that have resulted in them doing a little bit less of this. Or I'll take that back. It's not less feel good work. It's that we're getting more out of their feel good work. So instead of them always being up here and, you know, they make 70, 80, 90% of their shots, they shift their perspective a little bit. So they're making 60% of their shots, but that feels pretty good to them because they see a lot of shots, go in still, the majority of their shots. And that's more than I would usually have them make. However, again, at times we want to see the ball go through the hoop. It's a good feeling and we got to play into what athletes want sometimes. Now, a couple quick considerations here. Number one is information versus movement variability. Information variability is more so when you go back to the perception action cycle. The perception and the decision are going to be different. And obviously the action will then be different because of that. But this is more so like in a small sided game, switching up the read that they're making, the information that they're receiving versus movement variability, maybe something that we manufacture a little bit more. This is usually, I would say, more leaning on the side of an on-air environment or an on-air setting where we can start to adjust how they move a little bit with different constraints or with different cues or encouraging them with those creativity constraints to try new things, right? So that's just something to understand, a concept to understand. And then the last thing is something I alluded to a little bit earlier, is that it's important to realize the difference between practice and functional movement variability, because sometimes we actually want to keep functional movement variability low through high practice variability, right? We want to keep those attractors consistent. We want to stay as consistent as possible in our technique, even with contextual interference or different defenders, right? So everyone just thinks, or not everyone, but a lot of people have created the misconception of like, well, variability isn't important because you're just telling kids to go out and, never focus on technique and do it a different way every time. That's not good. It's like, yeah, that would be pretty bad for me to go and tell everyone, hey, technique is not important at all. And I don't want you guys to stabilize or remain consistent in any form of your technique, any variables of your technique. No, it's not the case. I'm saying to build that consistency, that practice variability needs to be higher so that they have the difficulty and the chaos to work through to remain consistent in these. So I'll get off my soapbox on that one. Last one here, I believe, differential learning. This is just exploring the edges of technique and different constraints, right? So this is stuff that usually doesn't look game-like. Like we're purposely exaggerating certain things, whether this is like shooting an oversized basketball or an undersized basketball, dribbling one. In terms of shooting drills, I could go on and on here, but scoop shots here where the ball starts on the ground, they have to scoop it up from the ground into the shot as quickly as possible. Probably wouldn't do it in a game, but we're building certain qualities here. And actually, I'll save that for the why. 360 jumpers, they're jumping up in place, doing a 360, landing, and then quickly popping back up into the shot. Maybe something as simple as exaggerating the arc. Finishing drills, this could be something like, hey, you got to touch your shoulder or your knee, and then finish from there. This could be, if we want to get super crazy, a 360 layup, but also just like jumping from further out, trying to finish on the way down. So really exaggerating and expanding the limits a bit. And even defensive differential learning, right? Where we have defenders who are holding a ball above their head or hands are behind the back or they start on the ground or something that usually won't happen in a game, but we're expanding the limits of what they can do here for three main reasons. Number one is to amplify noise, the motor noise that we just talked about. Sometimes, especially when we can't get super fatigued or we don't have defenders available, we need to find ways to attune athletes to work through noise and just build problem solving ability, right? And even if you'll never do these in a game, you're building the ability to problem solve and to work through and to work through chaos. This also builds general qualities, right? So I always ask players, or I try to ask players, I don't always do it, but before we go into something, especially if it's a new player that walks in the gym, before we go into something that's a little bit unique, whether it's a 360 jumper or one of these crazy finishing drills, I'd like to get their opinion at first on, hey, why are we doing this, right? Sometimes they'll be like, I have no idea, bro. Like, you just got me doing some crazy shit. Sometimes, most times, they're able to identify the qualities that we're building, right? So if we're saying, hey, you're going to jump from as far as you can and finish at the rim with your left hand. Okay, well, obviously, when you jump as far as you can and have to finish at the rim, you are going to finish on the way down, right? So we're learning how to finish with downward momentum at the last second. Obviously we're building like some body control ability, but also the ability to jump horizontally and finish, which is very important. The ability to find and stay tracking the rim, even through a little bit of chaos, as you're jumping from pretty far out and feel a little bit out of control. So behind all these crazy drills, there are usually qualities or what I call puzzle pieces of bigger skills that we are building, right? They may not be executing this exact thing in a game, but because of this exaggeration, they're building skills at a high level that will apply to a game. And I would say it's best used in on-air lighter sessions for specific purposes or for specific purposes. So again, if you really notice that a group of players sucks at X skill, and then at times it may be worth taking out the representativeness or the reflection of an actual game and building individual qualities behind that, right? So if players suck at finishing through contact, even in a group setting or a team practice, you could go a lot of finishing with contact, but then also go, hey, look, we're going to build certain qualities or puzzle pieces behind this, such as body control, which we do some of these crazy stuff. What else? Oh yeah, like extending outside of the body, right? Finishing with contact. Sometimes you have to go outside and really extend. So maybe we exaggerate that on finishes, finding the rim, all these different skills. Sometimes it's worth, and it's fun, really for all athletes to, push the limits that they have within these skills.
So if you watch our shooting training, as players get more experience, you may see some weird shots sometimes. This is called differential learning, and I'll explain the science to you in under 40 seconds here. So think of shooting in this case like scanning a fingerprint. If you only put your thumb on there in one place, it only learns that one area, that one path. But for anyone who's done a fingerprint, you got to move it around, expose it to all the different creases and grooves in the fingerprint, and that allows it to build a full image. It's the same thing with learning a skill. The more that you expose your brain to, the more your brain builds a full, flexible map of how to move. So no matter how much or how little you need to adjust your shot in a game, which is going to happen, you'll be ready because you've practiced adapting so much. So we're not practicing these shots. We're practicing our ability to adapt and solve problems, as well as training and exaggerating some of the qualities here, like balance or rotational control. Now, of course, there's a balance that we need to strike, and this isn't going to be the bulk of our training with most players, but it's an immensely valuable method.
So hopefully that clarifies why y'all see us do some crazy stuff sometimes. Any questions before we get into this? This will be the last section and pretty short. So, but feel free to ask any questions on that motor learning side. Nothing. Somebody got one? I can't see you guys. My bad.
Yeah, Hardwood Jungle has their hand raised. Do they want to ask first or not?
Either
No,
one.
that was from later on. So Cole, how you doing?
What up, man? Good to hear from you, brother.
Likewise, I'll ask at the end because it cool. Doesn't have to. It's not relevant to the last section we talked about.
Easy.
Just real quick.
Yeah.
I know I spent a lot of my sessions on defense. Like how would you work defense into this? I know there's not a lot of like variability in the defense per se. But like how do you work that into this?
Man,
process?
fantastic question. You guys are reading my mind. I literally just recorded a podcast on building defense through this approach yesterday, so it'll come out next week. But long story short, and once again, as with all these, I'm very glad you asked that because that's something that I think is very utilized, I guess, in player development, and we don't have enough of a focus on it. Not to go on a rant, but like, it's always this time of year where I talk to coaches and like, man, like our guys just, we can't defend as a team. We're letting too many points up. And I'm like, all right, what are you doing to work on your defense? It's like, yeah, we're doing shell drill or even if it's like, quality team defensive drills, it's all team focused, right? But just like somebody would understand, hopefully, that if you have all bad shooters, you're not going to be a shooting team. People need to understand, coaches need to understand that if you have all poor individual defenders who have never focused on individually developing as a defender, you are going to have a bad defensive team, no matter your principles, right? So long story short, I would say a lot of this comes down to 3 different areas. I always approach defense in 3 different areas. One is the skill. Second is the movement ability. Third is obviously the effort, the motor behind it as well. Skill wise, I would say a lot of this comes from implementing more small-sided games into your training and cueing the defense and challenging the defense through this, right? So usually when I run a workout, and I even ran one last night here, with some of our younger athletes, and we'll set up it's called a 1v1, right? Usually in these games, the defense is at a little bit of a disadvantage. So naturally, they're going to accumulate more reps playing defense and building that skill of anticipating, of taking the right angle, of being like crafty, right, and finding these different techniques that they'll never get if they're only doing team-based defensive stuff and if they're only doing on-air defensive stuff, like, you know, defensive slides. So naturally, a lot of these games will build it, and then I'll go around and try to cue the defense to do certain things, whether it's, you know, hey, on this one, try to anticipate them and beat them to the spot. Hey, on this one, as you're getting around this ball screen, you know, try to get to that outside shoulder and see if you can get a swipe. Not only does this make the defenders better, but now you are building more of a problem for or more complex problem for the offense to solve because, you know, the defenders are playing harder, trying certain things. So a lot of this comes naturally with that, as well as like going around and cueing the defense in the games to the point where, like, if you're running a session, you can essentially focus on offense and defense the entire session at once because they're constantly toggling between offense and defense. Beyond that, you know, we will do a good amount of stuff that does focus on defense. And a lot of that is, like I said, or like I used as an example a little bit earlier, like either putting constraints on the defense or experimenting with a little like differential learning, exaggerating their stuff. So that's where we'll have players maybe start like at a really disadvantaged position. So imagine like they get crossed over super bad. They have a little bit of space between them and the defender, and the game will start there where whenever I say go or whenever the offense goes or whatever, the defense has to find an angle to get back into the play, and they're holding a ball above their head to constrain how they move. So now they have to work through that challenge, right? So that can be a defensive focused drill where we're working on recovery ability and doing it through more constrained movement, but also, of course, giving the offense a chance to work on their game as well. And then like from a mindset standpoint, we've seen a ton of results with like players who just don't have a high motor by having them play live defense a lot and doing it with players who are better than them, and then talking a little shit, you know, putting them at a disadvantage, even incentivizing them through like the game structure to get stops. So in a normal small sided game, usually if you score, it's a point, right? Pretty standard, but we'll have full sessions where you have to get a stop, right, to get on offense and to get a point. And that in itself just naturally starts to ramp up the motor a little bit over time, right? It takes potentially years to see some of these results. But if you approach all of this through the context of, all right, how can I get them building skill, becoming better movers, and building their motor, and then apply all of that through mostly small-sided games and then targeted work on their individual movement qualities, we've seen very good results. I will say that. And it's always been good to see. So I appreciate you bringing up the defensive side of the ball. It's very good.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, let's move into this, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions right after this. So we talked about, obviously, the constraints-led approach, which is more so the lens through which we see all of this, or a lens through which we can see the bulk of this. I don't want to tie everyone into strictly seeing through the CLA. We talked about how to build and how to understand movement, which is everything in basketball. And now we'll quickly discuss decision making, which really keys in, I would say, on that perception and decision in that cycle. So I always break this down between IQ and feel, right? When we talk about any decision that you make on the court, and I think you would be surprised at how many decisions we actually make on a game-to-game basis. It's probably, I'm not saying this as an over-exaggeration, tens of thousands of decisions when you think about, all right, how am I going to like take a step in this direction to space out, right? Where am I going to move up the court on this you know, transition opportunity, going for a rebound, not going for a rebound. Like there's so many decisions that we don't even understand are happening because they happen below the surface of consciousness. And much of what happens when these decisions happen below the surface of consciousness is because they're feel-based, more subconscious decisions, right? So feel for the game, I usually consider to be like our quick thinking brain. And these are literally different areas of the brain that operate when we make more of an instinctual decision, a reflex of sorts, versus when we make a conscious decision, right? Now, these feel-based decisions usually happen in under 400 milliseconds, like 0.4 of a second, right? Now, to actually perceive and see the cue, right? So to understand when a defender like kind of jumps out and you have to make a quick move, that's going to take you up to a quarter of a second to perceive that, to even like register that that's happening. Decision selection, so being able to actually decide that and processing what you are going to do next also is going to take up to 0.2 of a second, not more. And then movement initiation, so actually starting the movement, is also going to add another 150, 200 milliseconds, right? So you add these up. These are going to be way more than the time window that we have to make a decision in these very quick, like reaction-based movements that we make, right? So this could be, quickly seeing a pass, and we've all made those passes before where it's like we just see that window and we make the pass. We don't even really think about it. Making a quick like counter to a defender is a very common one. Even sometimes like shot selection in terms of layups, but usually those few things defensively, right? Anticipating much of this window cannot fit enough time for us to go through this entire perception action cycle. It's just not possible, right? So instead of relying on consciousness, which this would do, we are relying on more instincts, right? More instinctual decision making, which is going to engage the following areas of the brain that I know you guys probably don't care about, but basal ganglia and cerebellum, which are way more responsible for automaticity and recognizing patterns and then quickly coordinating things that cannot happen in this window of time, right? So examples, again, quick counter when driving, adjusting on a finish is a good one that I didn't mention, right? So you go up in the air, a defender flies over, and you quickly switch to the other hand. Nobody is thinking about these decisions because it is legit impossible. You cannot consciously process the speed of these decisions, and as a result, I see coaches all the time saying, hey, when this player puts this foot here and when you're driving downhill, you got to do this. And we literally cannot process that cue and apply it in that amount of time. As a result, we need to build this through experience, through repetition without repetition, right? It's the only way. We'll discuss that. IQ is the slow thinking brain. So this is something, that again can be processed in the conscious thoughts, call it half a second and above. So the areas of the brain here are going to engage your prefrontal cortex, right? So that's more geared towards conscious thinking and less so instinctual decisions. And then even anterior cingulate cortex, which is more so associated with actually like sorting through these options and choosing, which action to make, right? So this could be, hey, I notice a pattern in the help defense, right? That third layer defender steps over, even coming off a ball screen, right? I see that tag man stepping over. So I have enough time. I have half a second to say, all right, I think I'm going to make this pass to the shake guy coming up from the corner, right? That can happen. Sometimes it becomes more instinctual, becomes more automatic because you're so good at pattern recognition once you get to a certain level. But at first, this is going to be more conscious, and that's fine because we have the time to do this, right? Deciding to shoot a shot, so shot selection. Most times we can think, at least for a half a second, about, hey, should I shoot this or should I not, right? And this is what I would consider IQ. So feel super fast decisions, under the amount of time that is possible to consciously process something, a little bit more instinctual, close quarters type stuff. And then IQ are more so things that you can think about, right? So implications here, feel cannot be taught, but it can be learned, right? Think about that a little bit. Feel are decisions that you cannot teach to an athlete, but you can help them learn. How we help them learn these is putting them in these situations to make these feel-based decisions over and over again. So repetition without repetition in small-sided games where they're constantly making these quick decisions, these almost reflexual decisions that they're not actually thinking about, and they may try to think about it first, but we also don't want to cue them to think about because that can take away all their attentional currency, get them frustrated. And I see this all the time when people start using small-sided games at first and start really diving into this style of training is they'll go in and be like, hey, when that defender steps over and you see their right hand up, maybe that's when you try to switch to the left and then spin it this way with this wrist, right? And again, this is not 2K. This is not something that we can just pause and think and be like, what should I do here? No, these are unable to be taught. And I'm not saying that because I don't trust my or your ability to teach, but it's science. We cannot process these things in that brief amount of time. So repetition without repetition, small-sided games, making these decisions, experience is the way to go. IQ, we still want to build more so through actual decision making and solving problems, but IQ can be supplemented with more verbal. So, talking these things out, or preferably visual. So showing athletes how it looks, whether it's on film or a demonstration, conscious thinking, right? So if we go back to noticing a pattern that helps defense, that's where I may come off and I may teach through the game by going, hey, look, when you come off this ball screen, you should probably be looking for this. If this happens, try to see if you can make this option or make this pass, right? Deciding to shoot a shot. Obviously, we can coach up shot selection here because it's conscious. So these are the things that we can more verbally or visually supplement in our coaching. Now, this isn't to say that we cannot supplement feel, right? Showing or having athletes watch a ton of film to expose them to different movement solutions here is valuable. And, I've felt this before. I don't know if you guys have, but our players, we talk about it all the time, younger and older, where, they'll watch a bunch of Anthony Edwards or maybe their favorite players, Jalen Brunson or whatever the case may be. And they just start naturally using some of these techniques that they use. And I'm like, yo, were you trying to do that? And they're like, nah, I've obviously experimented with it. I was out in my backyard trying it, but it's not like I was trying to do it. So our brain is very good at connecting the dots, and starting to see the affordances or the opportunity to do something, and do something new, do something innovative that you've been working on. If we build that action capacity or if we even just expose athletes to this. So how I would supplement this feel is by just helping your athletes watch more film, full games. Highlights too are good, especially for this. But again, staying as far away from actually cueing them to think about these things as possible, because all that's going to do is create overthinkers. Now, what we have not discussed in this hour and a half, and this is perfect timing because I wanted to have some time for questions. Psychological science, which is, probably just as important as all this, understanding how athletes think and the confidence, the ups and downs and dealing with athletes through this, right? Like as coaches, we are very often, I don't want to say we're psychologists or therapists because, those people are best at what they do, but athletes come to us more than anyone to do these jobs. So we might as well understand the science behind psychology, which I talk about in the new book, to at least at a base level to be able to deal with these things because it's unavoidable. And you can't just be like, yeah, go see your, psychologist or therapist. Like, no, you got to be able to understand where athletes are coming from and how to deal with, at least bigger blanket issues. In terms of decision-making science, we didn't get into affordances, chunking, pattern recognition, which is really the depths of how athletes become better decision makers, but hopefully you guys have at least a surface level feel with IQ and feel. Visual science, understanding how athletes see, training that. How we communicate as coaches, there's a ton of research behind using analogies, guided discovery, promoting an external focus of attention for those of you guys who are familiar. Physiological quality, some more like strength and conditioning vibes, which I always have found to be very synergistic with the basketball side. They're both movement. Culture science, right? How to build a culture. Load management, recovery science. Like there's so much research out there for us to leverage as coaches. And I would strongly encourage you guys to use this as a springboard, not in terms of only the stuff that we just discussed at length, but these two, right? Take a screenshot. You guys will get the recording of this. Go in. Obviously I would love for you guys to hopefully go read the book, both books that I put out there because we discuss, many of this or much of this at length, but take a screenshot of this, ask ChatGPT what you can learn about this, have it give you different research papers to go and study, and then go out and try to apply it on the court, right? Experiment, ask questions, make these ideas more practical. Hopefully you guys will come back to me at some point, or I'll just see you and you're using some of these ideas, or ideas that you have created on your own and experimented with, and I can learn from you and take some ideas. And that's really how this industry and this field continues to grow, is that, everyone in here has a different profile in terms of what they're truly interested in, on the court. Everyone's going to have a different philosophy. So if everyone can use the science to at least inform or influence how they are seeing their player development, that is going to lead to a ton of evolution in how we do things. And everyone's got to be open-minded. Everyone needs to come in to each conversation with a blank slate. And, over the past almost decade now, I've done my best to do this on a daily basis. And I've learned from a lot of people, hopefully have taught a lot of people as well, or at least, provided people with ideas. And, trust me, it's very fun to approach player development this way. So that is the end of the presentation. If you guys have any questions, I would love to hear from you guys. I see a couple hands up, so, feel free to get to it.
Hey, what's up, Cole? It's Vinny
What up?
again. I'm
Yes,
back.
sir. Good to hear from you, man.
Sorry, everybody else cutting the line, jumping back in the express line right now. First of all, definitely gonna cop the book. The first book was amazing. Really helped me out. And for those that haven't, I was able to build out like 6 months worth of programming with my high school, middle school, and elementary school kids, like learning through the stuff. And I think a lot of people, and this is gonna lead to my question, I think a lot of people have done small-sided games, CLA, in some form of capacity in their coaching careers and their training careers. For me, in the last 10 years, just doing like small-sided games, I'm all in 100%. But one of the things I always wondered was, is there a science behind this piece? Does increasing the number of constraints in the drills in the small-sided games improve skill acquisition by leveraging athlete understanding, or does it risk degrading learning quality through noise? Like, is it an indicator of like, all right, like they're learning, I call it stacking the constraints. Are they learning better? Or is it just like I'm just throwing out like junk at them and then they're just playing through it? Because I have some samples of success and I feel like, oh, we're on to something. But I don't have anything concrete to say this is it right here. Or it could totally be BS.
Yeah, no, fantastic question. And that's something that I've honestly thought about and I'm somewhat undecided on. I think for me, what I do tell, especially like not younger coaches, but coaches who are first experimenting with this type of stuff, typically what the tendency will be there is like, all right, I'm just going to throw 8 constraints at these players and they're like, that's going to create the perfect environment, right? Most times what happens is the athletes end up focusing more on the drill and like remembering things versus actually executing. So what I'll typically say for either coaches who are just getting started with this or if players first come in the gym and they've never really been exposed to this style of training before, I'll go super simple with the constraints. Then from there, the goal is to continue increasing the complexity there where we can add in like you said, stack constraints so that now we can get super specific with certain things, but it's not overloading their ability to execute the drill, right? And that's honestly what I like so much about, like those 10 template games that I talked about is that you could literally set up your entire career's worth of workouts with just those 10 games, but that's where you can really get, detailed and specific with like constraints, stacking those things because players don't have to relearn the game, the rotation, the logistics behind it. They know what they're doing, but now you can start to say, you can start to add in, 2 or 3 constraints and a point system and get really detailed with it. So I think it's contextual depending on like how comfortable the athletes are with, this style of training, right? And I see this all around the world. Like I'll go to some places and players will have zero idea how to execute this, right? And it's fair. Like they've just never experienced small-sided games in general, let alone like really detailed CLA stuff. But then I'll go to some places and I'll work with like an academy. And in the first 5 minutes, I'm like, all right, I know exactly how their coach coaches them because I can see like they're used to, the smaller details and like, executing these games. And then that's when you can start to get more complex with the constraints. So definitely multifactorial, but I would say you definitely are onto something. And it's just about like, I would assume with your girls, like they're so easy probably to add in different creative constraints and they can execute it from there. It's just building up to that with each coach.
All right. Appreciate you.
Yes, sir. And I appreciate you, man. Who's next?
Hi, Cole. My name is
Yes, sir.
Salvatore from Canada. So, I had a couple questions that I wanted to ask you, mostly for developing the passing game as an individual. Because I've been noticing recently that quality of passes, pass selections, I've been going down. A lot of ISO things. Kids want the ball in their hands and they want to play. So my question to you is, how do you teach passing, basically? Or how do you teach which pass to throw, how to throw it, the technique necessarily for passing? I just want to pick your brain about that.
Yeah, great question. So to me, again, it comes down to, if you break it down into the perception action cycle, right? You need to help athletes see the opportunities to make passes. You need to help them decide which passes are the right ones to make. And then you need to build action capacity for them to make these passes accurately and through the defense with different styles and different techniques, right? Usually, I think passing is more of a feel-based skill in terms of like actually making an accurate pass, where it's hard to tell a player, it's hard to teach a player exactly how to throw an accurate pass. Obviously, though, the perception and the decision of it is more of an IQ-based skill where you can start to supplement some of this stuff. So we'll do a good amount of drills that are more so like quick little passes. Like, for example, instead of always doing 1v1, a lot of the time we'll add in a third player to it and make it a kind of pseudo 2v1, where a player has to make like a pass to a closeout or to some sort of movement off ball and do it accurately, for the offense to then engage their attack or their shot, whatever. So we just try to add in as many passes as possible to the process. It also just, especially the big group, engages players more rather than having that player sit in the line or, watch that ref. Now they at least have the challenge to make a good pass. So building the feel and the accuracy is really, is valuable to do there, as well as warm-ups, whether it's like something as simple with younger players like, what's it called? Ball tag, where you have to make like good passes and tag them with the ball. It can be like a little monkey in the middle style game, right? And I'll even do that with older players where you have like one defender in the middle and you got to make good passes around them. And you're just constantly getting repetition without repetition, not only making accurate passes, but also quickly finding the window through which you can make those passes. And then when we talk about perceiving the passes to make in a game, that's where much of this will come down to 2v2 and more, preferably 3v3, where you have more complexity. It's more so representative of a game, more contextual to a game. And that's where we like to play a ton of different, like, constrained, FIBA 3x3, certain ball screen situations, identifying which passes are most common in a game for these athletes and the style of basketball that they play, or the level that they're at, and then expose them to those things. And then sometimes even stepping in as a coach. Like, I made a post the other day where, again, like that pick and roll read where you're coming off and then you either pass it to, depending on what the tag defender does, the roll or the corner or the shake. Sometimes you step in as a coach and almost like amplify the affordance a bit so that you like really exaggerate it, right? Maybe sometimes you really jump in and then that cues them to make that pass a little bit more. So now you're opening up their perspective, and like decreasing the complexity a bit. So I would say it comes down to just a ton of repetition of like, good passes and field-based passes, which the last thing I'll say about this is with younger players, sometimes it doesn't have to be in the context of games. Like if they can't make a pass from the free throw line to half court, yeah, like sometimes it's just about like, all right, try to get it there as fast as you can and just put it to wherever your partner has their hands up, right? And as long as there's at least a little bit of variability and fun there, that works.
Yeah.
And then obviously build it up from there.
All right, perfect. I have a next question, but I'll let the others go first.
Nice, sounds good. Riley.
Yeah, hey, I appreciate you doing this, especially from a head coach's perspective. This has been really challenging for me to see how I can, like, implement this with my stuff. So you mentioned, like, you said, like, around the IQ, the feel or the IQ piece. Like, what's your take on the IP address model, or like for skill recall as opposed to like self-organization? Like in your fingerprint video, like the way I understand the two, it seems like you're trending towards a little bit of the IP, where it's like a bit of recall. But I'm curious, I'm not super studied in this. I'm curious, like, what are some faults maybe that you see on both sides of those learning theories? And then maybe you can like give me some feedback on like how does that fit your training, and even like your take on maybe even people's perspective on muscle memory. Like I'm going to use chat to find some more articles, but I'd love to hear your recommendations as well.
Nice. Yeah, for sure, man. So I think I always use it, and hopefully this will help. But I've always used the analogy of like a toolbox, right? Where I don't subscribe to muscle memory, but I subscribe to getting comfortable with a wide variety of options that you could recall,
Okay.
but that also we need to self-organize to recall. And I'll try to make that more simple here. But long story short, I think they're combined because the more that you expose yourself to the edges or different tools, you add all these different tools into your, like, imagine you're a handyman, you just add a bunch of tools into your truck. And then the more that you can kind of come out, and look at a job and be like, okay, I'm going to need this tool. And you have used that tool before, so you're comfortable with it. But that self-organization process is more of choosing the tool that you have added through maybe like not muscle memory, but like exposing yourself to. So, if we put that in the context of shooting, it's like, all right, I'm going to expose myself to this release point. I'm going to expose myself to this timing. I'm going to allow these to be recalled. And then how these are recalled is self-organizing to the environment, around me. And, you know, when you have more movement solutions available, you're more able to or I guess produce those movements. So, that's one of those concepts that I'm still trying to figure out how to simplify best for people,
Yeah.
because I think they work hand in hand, but like, again, there's so many concepts where people think like this or that, and it's more so like they kind of work together. And if you combine ideas, then, that really gives you the best perspective, in my opinion, practically on how to apply these things. Where again, even if we take it out of the shooting perspective, like ball handling wise, I want to I'll have like a mental checklist of certain styles of dribbles that I want players to build and become comfortable with. And then we put them in more free environments, more complex environments where they can choose and self-organize as to which ones they choose there, whether it's kind of cuffing the ball backwards or like letting the ball float or different stuff like that. So yeah, I'd say the simplest analogy is adding a bunch of tools to the toolbox and then helping athletes through experience figure out which tools to use. And each athlete may use a different tool in a different situation. That's kind of where self-organization comes in.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I feel like as a young coach who's like not brand new to this, but fairly new to this type of stuff is like sometimes it feels like those like deep papers and stuff are really splitting hairs on some stuff.
Yeah.
And like, how do you know the balance? Because some people are like, no, throw everything out on this side. It's here. And I mean, like we've talked about that before too. Like even in presenting, you present in a ditch so that people come out in the middle.
Exactly.
So it's hard to know like what the balances are. So I was just curious about that. So I
Yeah.
appreciate you doing this. This is some deep stuff, good stuff.
Yes, sir. And I appreciate you, man. It's a good shout.
Just first of all, thanks a lot for this masterclass and for the value you bring during this 1 hour and a half, and for each hooper and trainer in this masterclass currently who asked question. The question was very high valuable, so thanks a lot about that. I'm a strong as a player and as a trainer too. I'm a strong believer on visualization, and when you talk about motor learning science or about movement pattern, about the different variability you can put in place through your workout and through your basketball journey, you know, um, in your point of view, how you will implement properly and in the best way to get the best outcome and be the most effective the visualization training to get access to your variability about functional movement or about the recognition of some pattern or to make your decision faster, how you will implement visualization properly and in the best way to optimize this area of the game and of the training.
Yeah, great question, man. So visualization to me is extremely important in two different contexts. One is off the court, right? So there's a lot of research obviously behind visualization, essentially helping you practice a skill without actually doing the skill. Obviously we still need to do the skill, but, you can essentially get the same neurons to fire to a lower extent, by just intensely visualizing something. So that's very valuable, especially as you get more experience playing. You're able to visualize like everything more in depth, different decisions, different feels. And that's why I've always felt like, as basketball players, we've always kind of like dribbled around like with a fake basketball and like, made little moves on like people on the street and stuff. And I always feel like that's helped in a way because you're just constantly like getting mental reps. The second part of visualization that I think is even more important is on the court, right? And this is where as players get more experience and as you help players work through this, in their on-air training, they start to execute everything as if it were a game, right? So they start to look in different directions. They start to slow down a little bit. Maybe like, if you watch a high-level player workout, you don't have to tell them, hey, keep the ball away because they're like adjusting their pickup point for the defense every time. And, I call it forced imperfection where they just like, instead of a defender being out there or even a constraint being out there to help you implement the imperfection of a game through visualization, you're just doing that yourself, right? And helping players do this in their practice, especially their on-air practice is very, very valuable. It's something that, I try to help players do by saying like, hey, imagine this is going on here. Imagine this is going on here. And then just getting them a ton of experience. So, after a couple of years, they can see everything. Even if there's nobody else on the court, they can see everything and see how defenders would react. And, at that point, they're on-air training. They're not really reacting, but it seems like they're reacting way more than a player who doesn't visualize anything. And that's incredibly valuable to get more variability, more difficulty, more results out of it. Great question, man. These are some fire questions. I'm not going to lie. All right. We got 10 more minutes here. So let's get through these.
Hey, Coach. My question was involving what role do you see competition having in player development? Is it an enhancer? I assume so, but what do you see and who you train and what you do?
So competition meaning like games or more so just like competing within in a training?
Yeah, within a training, really. I know that some coaches use point systems to track, someone who wins the game. And do you find that is something that leads to higher development from players?
Great. Yeah, really. Another good question. I feel like I'm just spamming that at this point. So this is also very context dependent, again, on the group you're working with and how used to this style of training they are. We found that sometimes point systems work extremely well to build higher intent. Sometimes they don't, right? That depends on the competition level of the athletes, what their priorities are. Some athletes just really want to win. So if you put a point system out there, they're going to go super hard. However, with that, they also may experiment less because all they want to do is win. So they're going to try to go back to what they're comfortable with versus exploring a little bit more, knowing that they may lose, right? Other players are right in the middle where they understand it. Like most players, that come to our gym for an extended period of time, they get like, all right, I want to win, but also I can explore a little bit, and it's not really winning if I don't explore. And I don't like try some things that I'm maybe not good at yet. And then some players just don't care about winning, so it doesn't really do anything. So I think understanding the psychological profiles of the athletes and the group that you're working with is very important. But then also building a culture that prioritizes these things, right? All your athletes may come in and they're not the most competitive, but over time you can start to ease into this more competition-based stuff, where, you have a win the day like we do a lot of times during the summer. At least in the more competitive ones are the ones that we want to be higher intent. And then, if we're going for a little bit lower intensity of a session, then we'll still have points, but it won't be super robust in terms of like win the day structures and stuff like that. So hopefully that helps. Patrick.
Hey, Coleman, appreciate it. Hope everyone's doing good on the call. My name is Pat Quinn from Atlanta. My question has to be, at the moment, I'm only working with pro athletes. How has your experience been, and what you've seen on, obviously, a lot of older coaches, older players, they're kind of stuck in the block training. How have you seen the best teams in the world? Obviously, Alex and Kenny brought in their new stuff. And then I see Donovan Mitchell in the gym, and he's like strictly block, same reps after rep. How have you seen those coaches try to, and yourself try to, smooth out the transition for players of that level?
Great question. And so this is something that's, I think the Donovan example is perfect because hopefully I'm not sharing any confidential information here, but, I was talking to Alex the other day and he's like, yeah, most guys at this level, and this is not just Alex's experience, but many others from what I've seen and heard, it's going to take a little while for them to understand it. But over time, like it's gotten to the point where Donovan's shooting oversized balls and, doing all the differential learning stuff at this point. He's also averaging 30 a game. I don't know. Career high may be correlated with that or not correlated with it. However, that's a similar process to what I see most often with people who do this the right way, or in a way that's more of able to find a middle ground where instead of going in and saying, this is the way to do it, screw you guys, I'm doing everything, super contemporary, out of, I guess just completely out of context of traditional training, usually doesn't go right because everyone's like, no, like it's just natural. It's human nature to resist something that is not, known to you, that you're not good at, whatever the case may be, versus, and this is something that whether it's me working with a team, whether it's me working with, coaching staff or players in the off season, it's always like, all right, let's just find the little things that we can implement at first and then ramp our way up. I usually find small sided games are very easy to implement versus something like differential learning because you can always bring it back to the point where it's like, yeah, guys got to make better decisions and compete more, and then even every NBA coach loves hearing decision making at this point. So if you go in with like a little bit more of like a decision making or like we're building the fundamentals of decision making and using some of the buzzwords that they use to you and kind of flipping it against them, I found that works very well. Even like old head coaches again who talk about like, yeah, on air training, you gotta do this, that. I'm like, yo, how did you get good at basketball? You probably went out to the park every day for 10 hours a day when you were a kid and played, right? And then in the off season, if you're a professional player, what'd you do? You probably played a lot of pickup. Like this is before skills training. You were pretty good, right? Yeah. Well, that's all we're trying to do is just refine these methods in a more productive way where athletes are competing, they're getting better decision making, they're keeping that fire, they're enjoying it. And most times coaches at least are pretty receptive to that. What I found with athletes is they love this shit. Like unless you're a vet, who's kind of just done everything in a routine your entire life, which is very understandable why you wouldn't want to change that, especially younger guys, younger girls, like they're competing, they're exploring, they're experimenting. And at some point when the athletes love it, and there are more athletes based on conversations I've had with staffs this year who are starting to implement this than you think, like all-star level guys. Once these guys start to come forward a little bit to staffs and be like, this is the way to do things, I can feel this working, I enjoy this, then people are really going to start to change their perspective at the highest level. And I think it's only a matter of time. And until then, obviously it takes finding that middle ground, but for now, it's probably the way to do it. And then at some point it'll really just kind of be accepted more widely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I think we got time for one more. Let's go.
Yeah, so my second question is more about, I'm for sure gonna grab the books that you recommended, but other than the ones that you wrote, do you have any like maybe top 3 basketball books or learning culture leadership books that really stuck with you or helped you to get into a process of learning and going into these rabbit holes of learning?
Yeah, for sure. So I'd say obviously all the similar, not similar, but like in the same realm. So like, Alex's book, Transforming Basketball, is great. Obviously all the Rob Gray stuff that if you're interested in this type of stuff, you may have heard of. So How We Learn to Move. And then the sequels to that. Culture Code is a fantastic one. That's one that really changed. I read it like right before I opened the gym here and has completely changed everything in terms of how we develop athletes and build a culture. I'm trying to think of a more unique one here to help out. There's one that I'm thinking of because, obviously we've been talking a lot about creativity that, I can't remember the exact title of, but it's geared around just building creativity, not only on, like, obviously not through a basketball, lens, but more so just a life lens. And that not only helped me as a coach, but also like kind of reverse engineer,
Mm-hmm.
how an athlete can be creative from like a psychological standpoint. So, shoot me a message and I'm going to go look at my bookshelf in there. I read it like 5 years ago and I
All right,
will,
perfect.
do that.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right. Let's get one more quick one in. Saw a hand just get raised. Oh, alrighty. Well, if nobody has any more questions, then I think we are good to go. I appreciate you guys for sticking around with me for 120 minutes. I know, it's a lot of time on a Saturday, regardless of where you are, but, questions were fantastic. Hopefully you guys learned a lot from this. If you're still around, the book just dropped today, Modern Basketball Blueprint, which, dives into all of this and, way more depth. So definitely check that out. It'll be on the website, Instagram, all that stuff. And if you guys ever need anything from me, ever have any questions, feel free to reach out because, I'm there for it, man. I love talking about this stuff. So appreciate you guys and hopefully you guys enjoy the rest of your Saturday.
Thank you, Cole. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir.